The world before the flood was very different than the world as we know it today. Genesis 1:7 tells us, "And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so." We learn in verse 20 that the birds were to fly in the expanse, which means the atmosphere. Therefore, we conclude that previous to the flood, the earth was surrounded by an enclosure of moisture, a vapor canopy. Whereas now we only have small amounts of moisture and scattered clouds. In the past, evidently, there was a heavy envelope of moisture entirely surrounding the earth. The waters which were held above the earth in this canopy were the waters above, as described in Genesis 1:7. The waters in the ocean below were the waters below, as described in the same verse. Now, this theory is an entirely reasonable assumption when we remember that there are 3 other planets in our solar system that have similar cloud covers at the present time: Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus. The weight of the canopy on Venus adds to the atmospheric pressure, making it more than 300 pounds per square inch. It increases the temperature at the surface of the planet to about 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the moisture in the Earth's canopy would help account for a great deal of water that is now on the Earth that science cannot account for. This is clearly seen on a topographical map of the ocean floor. The top 500 feet of water of the oceans of the Earth is of recent origin. Now, by recent, we mean in the last several thousand years. This is learned from what we find on the continental shelves. On all the continents of the world, the land slopes gradually down to the water's edge and then continues sloping to a depth of about 500 feet. Then it drops off into the deep oceanic trenches. Now, just a few thousand years ago, this was all dry land. This we know because of what we find there. For instance, we find freshwater rivers, freshwater shells, freshwater peat bogs, and the remnants of trees and the remnants of animals. Now, if we take only 1/2 of the water recently added to the oceans and place it up in the atmosphere in this canopy, we're able to make some numerical assumptions about conditions of the Earth before the flood. The temperature would have been the same all around the Earth, probably about 90 degrees. The canopy then would have produced a greenhouse effect. This would have made the entire Earth a tropical paradise with dense foliage all over the globe. And the fact that fossils of tropical growth have been found in abundance in the northern regions of our world tends to confirm our theory. Related to this greenhouse condition is the statement in Genesis 2:5 and 6 that it did not rain in the days before the flood, but that the earth was watered with a mist. This condition was the same as in the terrariums we have in our homes, where plants are placed in a glass enclosure. Then, even without watering, plants continue to grow. This particular jar was sealed over 2 years ago, and no moisture has ever been added. Another condition existing under the canopy would be a higher atmospheric pressure. This was probably right around 6 times what it is now on the Earth. Another effect of the canopy would be the shielding of the Earth's inhabitants from harmful cosmic and solar rays. Now, the chief effect of such radiation is aging. Undue exposure to the sun or to X-rays tends to age people more rapidly than if they were protected. Doctors and nurses who work with X-rays live on an average of 5 years less than other medical workers. This canopy shielding would also account then for the long lifespan of those who lived before the flood, some almost 1,000 years. Thus, we find adequate scientific backing for this theory of the Earth's condition before the flood. And this theory would have accounted for all the water necessary to produce a flood of the depth that Genesis describes. But the physical aspects of the earth are not the only considerations. It was the evil thoughts and the actions of mankind that brought about the flood. This behavior was a result of certain conditions that were existing upon the earth. First, lifespans were longer. Second, population was extensive. Third, there are clues that knowledge before the flood was farther advanced than we might first guess. Fourth, immorality and violence were rampant. The fifth condition was that faith in God was almost non-existent. Thus the stage is set. The physical world had the tremendous amounts of water in storage, which were the means of judgment. It was the social and moral conditions that were the reason of judgment. And God was the initiator of judgment. However, it was not only the oceans that were involved in the flood. It was also the canopy which collapsed, providing the rain that fell for 40 days and 40 nights. But what caused the canopy to condense? Well, it's not known for sure, but the strongest possibility is volcanic action. Nothing seems to cool the Earth's atmosphere like an erupting volcano. When Krakatoa in the Dutch East Indies erupted in 1883, it spewed 3 cubic miles of smoke and dust into the atmosphere. The temperature all over the Earth dropped several degrees, and sunsets were red for many, many months following. Simultaneous eruptions in several places on the Earth would provide enough drop in temperature to collapse the entire canopy in the form of rain. It is interesting to note that a heavy layer of volcanic ash has been found beneath the polar ice cap. Thus, with the oceans washing over the continents and the rain falling for 40 days and nights, the judgment of God was carried out. Mankind was receiving the wages of sin. Now, what were the results of the flood? First of all, there was drowning. This was the purpose of the deluge, the destruction of all air-breathing life, especially man. This was the most catastrophic tragedy in the history of the world, and it was occasioned by man's sin and rebellion against God. But it was a means of judgment never to be repeated, for with the collapse of the canopy, there was no way to repeat the event. And by the same token, now with the removal of the canopy, a rainbow would be possible for the first time in history. And that sign God chose as his promise that never again would he judge the world by such a flood. The historical account of Noah's Ark should impress us with the reality of judgment. A righteous God who could not excuse sin in Noah's day will not overlook sin in our day. Jesus said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man." Thus Jesus verified the authenticity of Noah's account and related it to the time of his own return, when conditions will be the same as before the flood. The Apostle Peter also believed the story and showed that a judgment of the past assures a judgment of the future. He further warns us that there would be some who would willingly forget that God judged the ancient world, holding all that water in store by his word. Now God holds another judgment in store, this time by fire. And for that judgment, we must all prepare.